Hello and welcome back to Raw Sports Interviews. I am your head of sport, Josh Sim, and with me today, down below me, you've recognized him from our previous streams. We've got Dami with us. Dami, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you very much. Sun is shining, so yeah, feeling a very upbeat mood today.
Yeah, and I guess to my left, I guess on this kind of formation, we've got we are fortunate to be joined by the Guardians, the sports section of the Guardian, the deputy editor Ed Aarons joins us. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Ed. And yeah, we're very excited to have you.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here. Thanks for your interest in the book.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about the book in just a bit. But I just wanted to kind of, I guess now with football back in the swing of things, I just wanted to, what's been the interesting storyline for you so far since it's come back? Has there been something that stood out? I know, there's obviously been. I mean, if you look at across certainly you look at the Premier League, Arsenal in bad form has obviously been a bit of a exclamation mark, should we say? And obviously, I mean, the rust and the fact that teams are obviously getting back into the swing of things is obviously another one. But what to you has stood out since English football's come back?
Yeah, it's been a strange few days, I have to say. I went to my first match at the weekend, which was not in the Premier League, but it was an important game in the Championship, which was Fulham Brentford. So a local derby, but on a smaller scale than obviously Liverpool Everton or some of the other famous derbies we have in this country. But still, it was a really strange experience, I have to say, walking to the game and no fans around. That's the bit I really like. I was saying this to a friend yesterday as well. The bit I really like before a match, when you like anticipation and that, and kind of I always try and listen to conversations people are having, because you sometimes find out interesting things you might be able to write about in your match report, that kind of thing. And that was, I mean, that's the most striking thing for me, having been to one game and obviously watched quite a few on TV as well. The lack of atmosphere is really affecting the performances, I think, as well as the rustiness from them having been off for 3 months. I think that, especially we saw it in the Merseyside derby, although it always kind of finishes 0-0 at Goodison Park of late. But I don't know, there was just maybe a little bit of a lack of intensity. That's understandable because of the situation. But I think as teams get used to it, hopefully, things will improve. And also, it's going to get more and more serious, isn't it? As we get closer to the end of the season, matches are going to be even more crucial and pivotal to teams' various hopes. So I suppose we have to give it a bit of time, and it's just good that we've got it back, and it looks like everything is going quite well at the moment. So fingers crossed that continues.
Yeah. I was going to ask. Obviously, it's great we've got football back, but of course it's in the context of kind of quite unprecedented kind of era going on with the coronavirus pandemic, and as well, obviously, with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just kind of wanted to get your take on obviously the plane that was flown across the Etihad, I think 2 days ago, with the banner saying "White Lives Matter, Burnley." And I just kind of wanted, kind of get your take, I guess, as a white man yourself. Like, what do you, how do you take that? Do you see it as something that's kind of against the movement, or is it something that's needed or whatnot?
I thought it was absolutely sickening, to be honest. I was disgusted by it, and I just, I despair. I really despair at people that take that attitude, because they clearly just don't get what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to achieve, and it's just really quite depressing to think that there's people and actually and just looking at some of the replies and people who are like not hiding behind their feelings about this. They really want to get it out there. There's lots of people out there on Twitter, I think, and not just Burnley fans.
Yeah.
And an interesting question that somebody posed, and I don't know what the answer to this is, and I don't think we will, thankfully, in a way, unless it continues for a few months when fans do return. But what would be the atmosphere in stadiums in certain places if there were fans there and players were taking the knee at the start of the game? I fear that there may be quite a lot of people booing, and imagine the toxic environment that would create, and players perhaps not wanting to go and play. I don't know. I mean,
it's
really sad, and there's been a lot of great videos over the last couple of days. I was just watching Mike Wedderburn in Sky Sports.
Yeah, that was good. What he said.
I used to work with him on the breakfast show there, and I think he put it very eloquently, as well as he could. I mean, we had somebody, even when I was in the office yesterday at the Guardian, somebody ringing up the office and telling me, asking me why, it wasn't acceptable to have White Lives Matter. When I tried to explain it to him, sensibly, he just went off and wouldn't let me explain. So in the end, I just got lost my temper a little bit and said, "Well, you should just go and read a history book, mate," basically, and hung up the phone, because it's hard to keep trying to explain this to people when I don't know. It should be obvious to them. I suppose maybe if you don't grow up in a multicultural place, then it's not so obvious. But yeah, so it was a very sad day, I thought.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of follow up on that, I was going to ask what do you think football could do towards going? I guess obviously I know it's a wider societal issue, but what role can football obviously play in towards solving that? Because of course we've seen what I guess footballers themselves can do with what Marcus Rashford has done, kind of what Raheem Sterling is doing as well. So yeah, what role do you think it can play?
It's really difficult, but I think it can play a very important role. And like you mentioned, Marcus Rashford and Sterling, but I think it needs more people like that. But also, it needs more education in schools. That is the real issue. I think all of this is that people are kind of blinkered by their upbringings, and I don't know. I think football makes things more accessible as well. The whole. I mean, we're going to talk about my book in a minute, but this is relevant. Yeah. The whole thing began when I had a conversation with this guy called Manny Abikwe, who lives in Birmingham, and he got some lottery funding to do a project called Out of Africa, which was talking about a lot of the players in my book that came over, the early pioneers, and he got some funding for that and was teaching that in a few schools, and that kind of thing is really, really important, I think. And then maybe if you have a racist parent who has these views and you're learning about this interesting stuff in school, then maybe you can educate your parents a little bit. And you shouldn't have to, but that might help bring a new generation of less discriminatory people through, perhaps.
Yeah, and I mean, you've mentioned it, and it's a good transition, I guess. Your new book, Made in Africa, the history of African players in English football, it is out now. I have got a copy of it here. So we're going to cover my face with it. So that's out now. I think we've put a link to the Amazon UK where you can buy it in our video description. So if you guys are interested in purchasing the book, you can obviously go to the video description down below. Obviously, I guess the first question I had when seeing that you'd written this book was, what was it that drew you to African football? Because I know it's something that you've been interested in for a long time, or at least for a few years now. So what was it that drew you to African football, specifically, as opposed to because football, obviously there's so many subgenres of football. What was it about African football in particular?
I think as I'm approaching my 40th, well, I'm about a year away from being 40. So growing up in my era, I remember it as well. Not many black players, even even British black players, but I used to go and watch Crystal Palace a lot when I was a kid, because my local team, and we had more than half the team was black. And I don't know, and so people like Ian Wright and Mark Bright and John Salako, who was born in Nigeria, and Mark Bright, who had a Gambian father. And I don't know, I just was always interested in black players from that point of view. And then also at the same time in 1990, the World Cup, Cameroon got to the quarterfinals and played England. And it was an amazing match, and they should probably have won, really, but it went to extra time, and England won, and obviously went on to lose to Germany and West Germany in the semi-finals. Everyone knows about Gaza and everything. But after that, quite a few African players, well, not a few, a very slow at first trickle of African players started to come through. And I was at that sort of age where you're quite impressionable as a sort of, 10 to 15-year-old kid who loved football. And I started seeing all these guys who I've never seen play football like that before, like Peter Umluv, who played for Coventry, who's not too far away from you guys there in Warwick. Yeah. When Coventry were actually quite a good team in the top flight. and Premier League. He was the first African player to play in the Premier League, and really just followed it from there through to becoming a journalist. And I used to play, for example, when I was a kid, I used to play on computer games as Ghana because they had a guy called Tony Yeboah who played for Leeds, and he also played in Germany. And I spoke to Jurgen Klopp about him and how important he was in German society for racism, combating racism. And yeah, so and I followed it into my professional career as a journalist. I went to live in South Africa for the World Cup between 2009 and 2011. So I was there for lots of games there and watched Ghana all the way to the quarterfinals again. And since I came back, I've just kind of got quite good links with African players in this country, like with the agents and with players themselves. I just find mainly, I mean, this is a theme in the book, that the stories of African players and where they've come from are so unique and so interesting, and they've had to come through quite a lot of difficulties and to make it. And I just found that there were so many different stories, and I thought it was about time that kind of they were recognised for their impact in the English game.
Yeah, go. No. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna ask, what do you think is like the relationship with I'll say the Premier League, but I guess English football as a whole, as with African players, how has that, I guess, improved and developed over time in a sense? And why do you think there's this African players themselves have this kind of draw, especially to the Premier League? Like, what is it about that attracts them a lot to always want to, like you said, they're risking, so many things, their livelihood, their families, all just to come to the Premier League. So what is it about it?
Well, the Premier. Well, first of all, I'll start with the first bit of the question, which was, how they got to come to English football, wasn't it? And that was really slow, like compared to everywhere in Western Europe. The big 5 leagues, if you like. Or maybe not so much Spain, but certainly like France and Germany, even like English clubs were not really recruiting African players until the 90s and the mid 90s at that, really, not even the early 90s. Whereas in France, they've been recruiting players from their ex-colonies from way back, and even some players from English-speaking African countries. Like I was talking about someone the other day, Abidi Pele, who's the father of Jordan Ayew and Andre Ayew. Obviously, he's from Ghana and it speaks English, but there was no pathway for him into English football in that era. So in the early 90s, and he played alongside Chris Waddle at Marseille, and they won the European Cup. So he was a fantastic player, and so it was people like Peter Unlove and Lucas Radebe and Tony Yeboah, and even like later on JJ Okocha and Kanu from Arsenal, who really sort of established the pathway to England. And it obviously, especially in the English-speaking countries, it's long before has been like the ultimate promised land of football. Like the ultimate goal where everyone wants to play, because they have for years been watching it in their home countries. And that since the Premier League has just exploded, hasn't it? The Premier League is now a global phenomenon, and there's people in every country in Africa. There's hundreds of thousands, millions of Chelsea supporters or Arsenal supporters or Liverpool supporters. It's kind of, they become global clubs, haven't they? And African players obviously want to play at the pinnacle like everybody. And, I think the Premier League is, for most of them, still like that. Obviously, there are some other clubs around Europe that are a big draw as well. But I think for most of them, it's the goal to play in the Premier League.
Yeah, and obviously one of the great things about your book is that it goes beyond 1992 when the Premier League was created. It goes so far back to the beginning of or more to the earliest part of the 20th century. And I was reading about the Arthur Wharton chapter last night. One of the first players to go from Africa to England and play regularly there and play professional football there. Was researching players like him from that time period, was that one of the biggest challenges in researching for this book? Was that kind of one of the biggest things that you kind of had to spend a lot of time in looking into?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of in the book. I'm obviously a storyteller, historian kind of thing, trying to tell the whole a massive story over hundreds of years. It goes back to really 1885. That's when Arthur Wharton played football, league football for the first time, and it came from Ghana. And yeah, a lot of the stuff for him was done by other historians, I have to say. And it's a lot of the book is also about how these guys were forgotten about. Like, it wasn't until, honestly, 1995, no one knew who Arthur Wharton was. No one remembered his name, that he was the first black player to play in English football, first African player as well. No one knew anything about him until, I think it was actually a few years earlier. There was a historian at a university, and he found out quite a few things and started to write something, but unfortunately died. And then it was taken on by another historian. He's a friend of mine called Phil Vasali, and he wrote a book about it. And then since then, it snowballed into him getting a statue at St George's Park because another person took it upon himself to say, this guy should be venerated by our society, and he was forgotten about. And there's quite a few examples of that in the book, especially with the earlier players, where probably because they were black, really, they were forgotten about, and no one really venerated them how they should have been venerated because of that kind of, I don't know, discrimination, racist attitudes, I think, at the time. People probably didn't realise the significance at the time, and they just faded into history. And also, a lot of these guys ended up with having quite personal problems as a result, probably, of some of the discrimination that they faced in their lives. So, I thought it was really important to tell their stories through other people as well. And but I have to admit, it was a massive effort to try and bring it all together. It's supposed to take to me best part of 5 years, really. But I'd say about 4 years of that were working on the historical bits of it, and then the last year was obviously there's two storylines in it. There's the old players, and then the more modern storyline, which culminates with the Liverpool team of today, with Sadio Mane and Salah and Naby Keita winning the Champions League. So I worked on that, obviously, in the contemporary time, and the earlier bit took a lot of research and me talking to people, and so yeah, it takes a long time, and there's lots of things that I've missed out, and I couldn't cover lots of players that I've had people messaging me saying, "Oh, why haven't you got this guy in there?" Or why is there not a Nigerian player on the cover? That's the biggest thing I've had. So, but there is going to be an updated edition of this. The plan is once Liverpool, wrap up the league, because it's kind of quite a big part of the story. We try and update it with a few bits, but yeah, I mean, it has. I have to admit, it's been a massive undertaking for my life. So, yeah, very proud to see that you've got a copy of it there.
Yeah, absolutely, and I, hoping that more people do get a copy of it, because it's a fascinating read, and I read in a previous interview that you've talked about this book being an eye opener for you in discovering the lack of progress made against racism. Was there anything in the book? Was there anything that when you're researching this book or when you were conducting interviews, was there anything that surprised you? This hasn't been resolved, or this is still a major issue. Was there anything like that surprised you at all?
Yeah, well, like I said, I think this the evolving storyline, because it took me 5 years, and I wrote it from a position of thinking that we were making lots of progress, because we don't hear racist chanting. Well, you don't hear racist chanting like you used to back in the day. Well, rarely, hopefully, you do sometimes at certain clubs, I suppose. But then, I thought this became part of the story, the whole thing that's been happening, this movement that was really kicked off by Raheem Sterling, and him calling out and beating the media, really, which was an amazing moment in not just football history, but sort of social history. I thought that when and that's in the book, that episode with the Mail. It's about the Daily Mail, we can say that, but that Phil Foden and Tosin Adarabioyo and how they were treated by the media, and it was just the latest example of what's been going on for a long time. And that in my book, there's lots of examples of it, unfortunately, and it kind of it does get better, if you like, in that it's not as harsh, because at the start, it's newspapers are using racist language, and it's kind of acceptable in society. And then as time goes on, you'll see that it's becoming, there's more people starting to speak out about it. But I think you can't underestimate the importance of what Sterling did with that, because you're seeing the effects of that. It's starting to feel like a real revolution that I think, you've got people of your sort of age are really leading that as well, which is really quite encouraging for the future, hopefully. So yeah, but like I say, it's an evolving story really, and that's why I'm probably going to try and do another updated edition in the future, perhaps, to see what happens to some of the younger players that I talk about in the book as well.
I think I know in the book you talk about Brian Steen and then the three brothers who all at one point played in the English Football League, and I think Brian also represented England as well. I just want to ask, like, when you were interviewing them, could you in a sense see, I guess, what they had to go through back then? Could you see it still, I guess, kind of manifesting in their life currently now? Or is it a case of where the racism and discrimination, it happened, it's there and it's moved on, and they were able to kind of, freely talk to you? Or could you kind of see the remnants of all of that kind of issue still, I guess, manifesting within their life to the current day?
It's a really interesting question. Yeah, and yes, I could most of the time when you had to. I mean, to be honest, the ones in the earlier, most of them are dead, or haven't had. I didn't get a chance to speak to them directly, but I spoke to their family members, and it really, like, you could see even them. It wasn't like directed at them, but the things that they've heard about what happened to their father or relative really affected them. And and in fact, I spoke to Edwin Steen earlier, who's the oldest brother. He called me earlier, funnily enough, this morning, and he told me he's been going on the Black Lives Matters march, and he's about 65 or something like that. He's so passionate about this because it was his father's calling. If you read that chapter about his father, anti-apartheid activist, it's basically the blood, isn't it? But yeah, I think he remembered also them going to watch Chelsea, like when they were teenagers, and bearing in mind that their youngest brother Mark went on to play for Chelsea, like in the 90s, did quite well there. They had people, their own fans, like you said, like urinating down the back of their legs and stuff, and like shouting abuse at them and stuff like that. And clearly, he still remembers that, like, not like it's yesterday maybe, but he just clearly remembers that, So yeah, it's bound to have effects on anyone who's been racially abused. I'm sure it does affect you your whole life.
Yeah, and you talk about the contemporary timeline of looking at the Liverpool players, and there's a strong African contingent there. I can name there's 4 of them I can name off the top of my head. And you were able to talk to Jurgen Klopp for this book, and so what was it like to get his perspective on African footballers? Because he's not, I don't think he would consider him the go-to person to talk about African footballers. But what was it like to get his point of view on his players and the different qualities and characteristics that they bring to the table?
Yeah, it was really interesting, and to be honest, I was a little bit surprised because they don't, when you try and get interviews with, I mean, if I tried to get an interview for the Guardian with Klopp on my own, for instance, like about Liverpool at the moment, it would just be a no, because it's just the way that it doesn't work like that, like you have to be quite lucky to get a sit down interview with for an hour with a top manager like that, but it was obviously a subject that he thought was close to his heart, and I didn't really realise it until I spoke to him how close to his heart it was, because I thought this is the guy that signed 3. Basically, the thinking behind it was he signed 3 players who's broken the African transfer record like 3 times in about 14 months. It was because Kaya didn't join until a year later, but they signed the deal, which was a new record. Like, it's just a few weeks after Salah moved, so it was like, he clearly has something about African players. I know they're all from different countries and they're not the same player or whatever, but also there's Joel Matip in there, and Divock Origi, who obviously plays for Belgium, but go into this in the book, is very much of Kenyan origin. And so to hear what Klopp had to say about it, there was quite a lot of surprising stuff about it, and he actually talked for quite a long time about his experiences as a player in Germany in the late 80s, early 90s, when, as I mentioned before, Tony Yeboah was kind of the only black player in the league, but finished top scorer in the Bundesliga, and really did quite a big deal, I think, in a country that obviously has had quite a lot of issues with racism in the past. And also, to mention Leroy Sané's dad, who was from Senegal, is from Senegal, and was a big star in Germany as well. But yeah, and Klopp was talking more about the contemporary players quite a bit as well, and about the differences between first of all, the individuals, and I mean, some of the stuff it's interspersed throughout the book in kind of within the storyline. But some of the stuff he mentioned about Mane, like little tips about how he how he can get better and what happened when they first met, and he just completely got it wrong. And he said he thought he had this cool attitude, and he had his baseball cap on backwards, and he was like, "No, this isn't the player for me." And then Sadio was like, "Well, I had to prove him wrong," and that's kind of what happened in the end. And I think Klopp can relate to what these guys have been through more than a lot of managers, because he obviously knows how to motivate not just African players but all players. And but the thing that really struck me about him was that it's something I've said to you already, but the stories behind these guys, like, you have to really have a lot of respect for them, and it actually gives them the edge, I think, sometimes over their competitors, because they've had to fight almost for their lives, really, to be there. And rather than the guy who's just got into academy, he's brought up in a nice house in wherever in England, and he gets into academy and he's in an academy and he becomes a pro. If it comes for fighting it out with a African player who's come from a village with no running water and stuff, and he's made it all that way, who's going to win the battle? It's kind of not necessarily, but they have a lot. I think Klopp recognises that a lot of African players have that desire to prove themselves and not to let anything get in their way.
I was also gonna ask. So obviously the book, like you said, it details the lives of various quite high-profile African players. Mane, Salah, even talks about a bit of Drogba, Torre. Just list of really great African players. But I just wanted to ask why you think that hasn't been able to, I guess, been translated onto the national scene, and I guess on the global scene for a lot of African countries, in the sense that why, I guess, the best African countries ever done is South Africa nearly reaching the semi-finals in 2010, I think it was.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
so
three teams have reached the quarterfinals. Senegal as well.
Senegal.
No, you know what? That's really because the trajectory. If you look at it, like if you put it on a chart, kind of thing, it was like we reached got to the quarterfinal in '90, having steadily progressed through getting beaten every time, and then Tunisia got through. Morocco got through in '86, the second round, and then the trajectory was very much, especially in 2010 when Ghana were like as close as you could ever get to get to the semi-final. It was like, well, the next step, semi-final, final, and win it or something. And Pele famously said in I think it was this is in my book, 1977. An African country will win the World Cup by 2000, and obviously we're 20 years later and not even a semi-finalist. So I don't know. I mean the Ivorian team, I think a lot of people had hopes for that because when a few years back when Drogba and the Tourés were there, and there's a Boué and quite a few others actually, as a Kalu, but they just didn't get it together at the big tournaments. And then the last tournament, it was a real setback for Africa because none of them got through. None of them made it even to the second round. Senegal were really unlucky. They're probably the best team, Senegal, I think. Obviously with Mane and Koulibaly and people like that. But I think it's really, one thing to say about it is it's very tough for them to get to the World Cup. Like if it's a shootout. It's whoever you get in the draw. It could be Algeria v Senegal, who are probably the two best teams at the moment. It's the way the draw goes, so you don't always get the best teams there. Plus, also, I think we may see it. I think we may see in the next few years that a lot of players are coming to Europe a bit younger and really getting their stuff together. But also the lack of finances and facilities when they go back home for training camps and stuff. Players are scattered all around the world. Whereas I know that a lot of countries like Brazil have to deal with that as well. But I think it's just a matter of time until an African country, achieves its potential. And the book actually ends. I don't want to spoil it for people, but I'll speak to one of the Senegalese vice presidents who runs an academy that produced Idrissa Gueye and lots of other players. And he's very ambitious, and he told me the chapter begins with, "We want to win the World Cup." So they're heading in the right direction because these two great academies that are producing brilliant players. And hopefully this success that we're seeing, in every league in Europe, not just in England, then it will eventually translate onto the international scene.
Yeah, and I guess just quickly to follow up on that as well. I just want to ask how, in the process, I guess, of writing this back, how often did you come across this trope, I guess, or rhetoric of African players just being quick, strong, and powerful, and how much do you think that kind of holds us back as well? Because obviously, it's in the sense that they describe Paul Pogba, oh, he's amazing, he's got physical, he's this, that, but no one talks about he's probably one of the most technical players you probably ever see in world football. I mean, you saw the pass he made, I think, 2 days ago against Tottenham. Like, not many players can do that. So I just wonder that how much do you think that also holds us back? And I guess how much that kind of stops us from, reaching these kind of top positions in football, e.g., winning the Ballon d'Or, for example.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I totally agree, and that's also in the last chapter. Kind of that's where it rounds off really with Mane saying very, very graciously saying, I didn't win it this year, kind of thing. But I think lots of people, think he should, and Messi voted.
Yeah, I think he should.
And I do as well. I do, and I think it is a factor. And I think like you mentioned this, and Pogba is always the person that comes up with this, and I agree totally with you. Like no one ever talks about his intelligence either, which is like, he's one of the most intelligent players out there, and it's always the same with African players. Like so, Kante. Let's take Kante as an example. He's obviously got an amazing engine, and he's great at attacking. But what makes him the player that he is for me is his brain.
Yeah.
His brain and his like intelligence knows where to be. So and you're right, it never gets mentioned about black players. And I think not just Ballon d'Or and things like that, but in terms of getting coaches and then even into the higher levels of directing football and senior officials at clubs, it's still that kind of it is a trope. It is a trope. I agree. And in fact, I was talking about this the other day, and I described it exactly as that. It dates back to some of these things that you'll read about in the book that are inherent in the way that people like grow up in England are like, and even some sort of quite liberal commentators just can't help themselves when it comes to black players that are using those labels.
Yeah.
I always notice it, that and they're not racist people, but it's just
subconscious bias. Yeah, they don't mean it, but it's just
I think you just got to think a bit more about like you're not just going to that stereotype, like that black players are only wingers or that's it, or tricky wingers. Well, Lucas Radebe. I think there was a chapter in the book actually that I called it the Chiefs, and it's about I put Radebe, Drogba, and Okocha together because those three kind of like they disabuse that ridiculous stereotype, by their leadership and their sort of the fact that they were icons that like even if you were a racist from Leeds or Chelsea or Bolton, like they were the guys that even if you were racist, you had to be colourblind about because you love them so much from those clubs. You know what I mean? And even fans of other clubs like love JJ Okocha and love Radebe. Maybe not so much Drogba because he was one of those people you love to hate. But I think those people were really important in development. But obviously, we're not there yet. There's still a long way to go in that respect.
Yeah, and I was thinking, piggybacking off Dami's question about the lack of success on the global stage for the national teams, for the African national teams. I was just having a think, and obviously, there's a lot. Obviously, the high profile, the top managers, coaching wise in football, tend to be from Europe. We've had a few from South America, obviously Bielsa at Leeds being one of them, and it just struck me that there's not been a high profile African football manager that's been able to achieve such prominence as the likes of I know I'm just putting their names in there, but Klopp and Guardiola or even a Bielsa standard. So and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you think, is there a reason why an African manager has failed to hit those heights yet? And is there, I mean, obviously we hope that one does sooner rather than later, but how long do you think that would be?
Well, number one is there's a lack of opportunities. There's never been an African I think you need somebody like a figurehead to do it. So there's high hopes of Vieira, but I don't think he's doing amazingly well. But obviously he's a great pedigree as a player. I'd like to see Aliou Cisse given a chance as well. He's the Senegalese manager, but I think he's got a mission before coming to Europe or anything like that, which is to take Senegal to the next World Cup and like really achieve something. and they're capable of it. I mean, as I mentioned before, they've got so many good players. Ismaila Sarr as well coming through, and lots of others that we probably haven't even heard of yet that'll be at the next World Cup. So yeah, but it is down to a lack of opportunities, and it applies across the board, doesn't it? Like not just to African managers, but like to black managers as well. And this is something that Raheem Sterling talks about on Question Time, wasn't it? So sorry, Newsnight the other week. Used the Cole and Sol Campbell and Ashley Cole example compared to Lampard and Gerrard. I think that's fair enough comparison, really. And I think a lot of black players are put off from going into management for some reason, and it's probably because of they don't need the hassle that they probably think they can get.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it needs one person to try and put themselves out there and do really well. But it doesn't have to be an ex-player, But and also from the other side, it really needs someone more, not just one person, but lots of clubs and lots of England are trying to do it at the moment, which is good. I think they've got a black coach with every age group now, which like some people call it tokenism. Which I don't know, it's debatable, but the thing is with England, I think that they are actually genuinely giving them opportunities, and that's great. That's great to see because you look at the number of black kids that are in the England youth system, and to have it doesn't mean you have to have a black coach, but it'd be nice to have someone to relate to, I suppose, as a player. Like I coach with someone. There's one. Well, I'm white, obviously, and my colleague's black. I think you can relate to someone who's not the same, not the same race as you. It doesn't matter. But the more a young kid sees, someone in a position of authority, the more they think that they can do it as well. So that's what it's all about.
Also, I was quickly going to ask, obviously, I know you mentioned you managed to interview Jurgen Klopp. I was just wondering, were you able to, did you, or even tried maybe getting in touch with possibly Arsene Wenger? Because he's got an amazing record with black players, especially. Obviously, I mean, I think George Weah, credits everything he's, got in his career or in his life to Wenger. So obviously, I know it's quite difficult. But
no, I did try to get in touch with him. Yeah, I did. But there's a chapter in there which is kind of, it's dedicated to Arsenal really, and I've told it like a bit of a weird story that probably people your age, I don't know. Sorry if you do, but you may not know about this guy, and that's what I wanted to do because everybody knows about Kanu and all the other superstars that were there. But Christopher Wray, who is from Liberia and is George Weah's cousin. He was the first African player to win the title, Premier League or First Division, and his story is amazing. He escaped from civil war basically. He's on the last plane out of Monrovia Airport before it was destroyed, like a week later, and he because of Wenger, and he calls Wenger his dad, and so that's one of my favourite chapters. It's sort of. I think it's chapter 11. I seem to remember, and it's Wenger really was very important, and I kind of put all the Arsenal players in. It feels a little bit that I shoved them all in together, but I wanted to kind of give props to Wenger for what he did, and yeah, absolutely, he began the revolution for African players in this country. I think Arsenal, this is right. They've had more African players than any. I think that's right. I think it's about 20. So there's been something like that. I'd have to double. I've done a breakdown in the book of each nation, each player from what nation they came from, but I've never actually collated what numbers of clubs, players at clubs. So I think Arsenal is probably one of the most anyway.
Yeah, I can definitely.
Obviously, Pepe now is the new record holder, African transfer record. So
yeah,
and Aubameyang.
I guess, and I know we've not got a whole lot of time, and I did want to ask about some journalism tips for like our student journalists who are looking to break into the industry. But I guess my final question on the book is that obviously there are loads of anecdotes in there, and I would recommend people go out and buying the book. Is there a particular anecdote that you think people will, is there one that you'd like people to kind of look up on the internet after they've read it about it? Is there one that when you wrote it, you thought that's the kind of person I'd like to spotlight particularly about in my writing?
I've just mentioned Christopher Wray, and I'll try and think of another example while I'm saying this. But yeah, the Christopher Wray one in particular,
okay.
And I have to, the story at the beginning about, having to bribe a guard to get on an aeroplane so he could go and basically when he was 15, or something like that. And then and also just about him, how like grateful he was for like me, not just me, but like being remembered, you know, like because he's like, oh, thank you for like thinking of me, basically, because he like has been forgotten about by quite a lot of people, even though, you know, because he was a real flash in the pan. He was only here for about a season, and he did scored some really important goals when they won the double. And then other ones, yeah, we've mentioned the Mark Steen and Brian Steen and Edwin Steen story. I'm, you know, really pleased about that one. And also the Peter and Love story is quite a funny one. It's about how this guy became his agent. He was basically a student in England from Zimbabwe, and he had when he was at home, I think it was at Christmas or something, he was having a drink with his friends, and they were told him about this Zimbabwean guy who just signed for Coventry, and he was like, no, he's never going to make it. And then he bet them that he could go and get his autograph, basically. And so he slept in his car overnight and then got in the training ground and then was introduced to Peter finally. And then Peter was chatting to him. Bobby Gould, who was the manager, came over and was like, oh, who's this? And he was like, oh, this gaffer, this is my agent. And he wasn't, he just met him, and they like, then he became his agent, you know, like negotiated a better deal for him with Coventry. Wow. And like just some funny sort of little anecdotes, how they went to KFC after the game and stuff, and talks about how much money he should be getting paid, because he was, you know, they took advantage of him. He came from Zimbabwe and he was a kid, he was like a teenager, and he was getting paid like really nothing, like 200 quid a week or something, and didn't have an agent. And this guy was, you know, still his agent now, like 30 years later. So there's things like that, you know, little stories like that that are good, hopefully.
Yeah. Go for it, Dami. Do you want?
Yeah, no, I think obviously probably just move on to, I guess, kind of like your industry and with journalism as well. I was going to ask, first of all, obviously, do you think it's kind of like obviously an issue that, I guess, I think off the top of my head, I think Darren Lewis is probably the only kind of like black kind of well-known, you know, football writer or correspondent or whatever you want to call it within, I guess, the journalism industry. And what do you, I guess, kind of like what is, you know, the Guardian and other newspapers, or what are they trying to do to, I guess, kind of boost and improve that numbers, I guess, make it more accessible, I guess, for people like me, for example?
Definitely. It's an issue. Well, we've had a recently we did a BAME like work experience scheme where we like, and that's something that's like not just in sport but throughout the Guardian. But I hold my hands up, and I always say this: we don't have enough black people in the, well, not non-white people really in the building, not just in sport, but especially, and this is the other newspapers too. You're right, Darren. I know Darren really well, and he's pretty much. Adrian Kajumba at the Mail is doing really well. But and there's a few people. Roshane Thomas is at the Athletic. But yeah, you're right. We were sort of talking about like it's ridiculous, and I think things need to be done to encourage people to, you know, hire more non-white people. You know, especially in these times. Hopefully, well, certainly our editor is very conscious of this, and you know, recently, he doesn't write about football very much, but you know, recently hired Samani Carriel, who's really great young journalist. Like writes a lot about tennis as well. But yeah, it's something that really needs to be worked on, because you see, you know, this will go on for however, you know, a couple of weeks maybe, and then people will think, well, it's time to go back to normal, and that's not what it's about, is it? It's about like keeping it going, and you know, this is also, I'd like to think that at the Guardian that this is something that we have been trying to promote for a long time, like racial issues. You know, it's not just flavour of the month for us. Kind of, you know, a lot of the work that I do, for instance, not just on the book, is about trying to do this sort of thing and like promote people who have, you know, not as many opportunities as others. So yeah, that's something that I definitely, you know, that's part of my sort of mantra of journey, if you like, the way I try to work. And there's a few people like that, I think, at the Guardian. So. We saw obviously we're very proud of the Windrush scandal. Still isn't resolved. So.
No. My final question, because I know kind of we're running out of time, and I'll just kind of hand it over to Josh. But I think in regards to that idea you're saying about it's not just flavour of the month and whatnot, I was wondering, with you being in the industry, in a sense, when obviously me as a reader, I read kind of stories of you know, how like the Daily Mail portrays kind of like Tosin Adarabioyo compared to someone like Phil Foden. I always wonder in my head, is it that the editors are telling them to kind of write the story like this because they know, I don't know, is it just to create like a massive scene, whether even though they don't believe it, but they know it will sell, or is it that they genuinely are, is it like they really believe it? Like, I'm always kind of quite confused. Like, I don't know, is it just for the publicity, or is this really how they kind of think, you know?
Well, it's hard for me to say what other people, you know, are inspired, or what their motive is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think a lot of the time, certain websites, like, it is about clickbait. Everyone knows that, don't they? It's like, you know, but it's an interesting one because, you know, at the moment it's a really fine line between certain newspapers are sort of flip flopping at the moment, aren't they? Like, you know, kind of 1 minute, you know, they're because everyone's so divided. I think some newspapers don't really know which demographics to appeal to at the moment. It's quite an interesting time, isn't it? Like, whereas, you know, the Guardian, we know who we want to appeal to all the time, you know. But at the moment, I think some of the sort of more right-wing papers are in a bit of a fuzz about it, which way. But yeah, I'd honestly hope that there's no malice meant at the heart of it. But they partly they don't realise like what they're doing. It's like you were talking about before. It's like subconscious, but then at the same time, you know.
I mean, when you read it, it doesn't.
Anyway.
Yeah, and I know we're about to finish. We're just about running out of time. I do have one quick question, and it is completely unrelated, lighthearted, but and this reference might go over the heads of many of our listeners or viewers. But here we go. As someone who listens to the Football Guardian weekly podcast, is Barry Glendenning in real life as grumpy as he seems to be?
Oh, poor old Barry. Don't be nasty about Barry. I love Barry. He's great. He's great. Yeah, he is. Actually saw him yesterday for the first time in ages, and he'd come into the office as well because he said he just wanted to get out of the house, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, he's a lovely guy. Sometimes we sometimes go for cigarettes together. So
fair. No, I was just wondering.
And yeah, he's good. He's great. Is he your favourite on the podcast then?
I mean, his bluntness and frankness is quite a marked change compared to I guess Max Rushton's high energy.
One thing I would say is sometimes like you kind of run out of conversation. Like it starts off really, you know, with someone like it starts off really well, and he's like, "All right, how are you?" And it's like, "Yeah," and then like you kind of, you know, I think he just gets bored quite quickly. That's really what it is.
Well, we've certainly not been bored of this conversation, and that's a very cheesy way to close this interview. But thank you so much, Dami. Obviously, always a pleasure to have you here with me.
Thank you, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
That was really good. Yeah, thanks for some really interesting questions. Things I haven't been asked at all. Like, you know, talking about.
Oh, that's like a badge of honor for us. Yeah. And obviously, thank you to Ed Aarons, the Guardian Sports deputy editor, for joining us. His book, I'll just cover my face again. His book, Made in Africa, the history of African players in English football, that is out now. Go buy it. It's a really good read of what I've read so far. I'm really looking forward to going through the rest of it. And we will be back with more content coming soon. So thank you all for watching.